All right, Austin, we are back for the bonus content. If you're with us, it's probably because you already just listened to the podcast, the audio podcast, and you want some more. So we're going to talk, Austin, about you take 5 very practical steps on how to become a pastor reader. So for the typical pastor who isn't a reader, these are the 5. I'll give you each 5 one at a time because you probably don't have the book out in front of you. And I know I've had the same thing where I have to remember what I wrote too, and it isn't always as easy to grab as people would think. You wrote it and you read it like 20 times. Yeah, but that was a couple of years ago. I've read a couple things since then. So let's go through the 5 of them. Takeaway number 1, to see it as a pastoral visit, or as you say, conceive of reading as a regular pastoral duty.
Yeah, that's right. I think that if folks do find the argument that it's more formative than informative, and if one can begin to reframe it from being not a luxury but a vocational responsibility, then the way to begin conceiving of reading then is think of it as a pastoral visit. When we go to visit with our members, we don't go in thinking we're the dispensers of all the wisdom and they're just going to be there on the receiving end of our wise pearls. Instead, we go in knowing that we're about to encounter another human being, and that while we're there to give pastoral care, we're going to be enriched just as much from the person-to-person encounter as they are. And that's the way that we ought to think about reading, that we're actually engaging with another human being. That human being may have been dead for thousands of years, but nonetheless, at one point, that was a real-life human being that was putting down whatever it is that we're reading. So we engage it that way. And then we see it as a conversation where it's a dynamic process, and that will only enrich our ability then to go and actually provide pastoral care on the flesh and blood pastoral visits, if we think of reading this way.
Feels to me a little bit like some of the healthy conversations that are happening around understanding in a renewed way the value of eating well, of exercising, of getting a good night's sleep. That these are not takeaways from performance, but they are part of enhancing our performance and our ability to do well what God has called us to do. And reading is of a similar type to me. So that's takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2 you give is don't start by trying to read too much. You lower the bar for us a little, which I appreciate. So let's talk through that.
Yeah, all folks who study the cultivation of habit, whether those are positive or negative habits, show that particularly when it's a positive habit, it doesn't take if you try to do, way too much at once. You burn out right away. That instead you got to start slowly and steadily and build up. So I just apply that to this reading habit, which, as I'd said in the interview proper, that we ought to not think of it as a habit though, but as a spiritual discipline. So yeah, start out small, start out with 30 minutes to an hour, if possible, an hour, but even if 30 minutes, and just start out by reading what you want to read, but put it in the calendar and make it a daily habit.
And hold no knowledge or writing in contempt. We talked about this a little bit in the main podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Read widely, read generously. That we weren't really expanded and enriched if we're only reading the things that are already saying amen to everything that we ourselves think.
A sub point to this is that you recommend having several items going at once, which is something that I've been doing for years now. What's the value of having, for me, there's always like at least one audiobook, one ebook, one print book. I always make sure that there's something in fiction, something in nonfiction, something in ministry, something in non-ministry related. So there's usually 3, 4, up to 5 books going at a time. I feel the advantage of that. Tell us what some of the advantages are to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of readers just naturally do that. And one of the things that's now been found is that there's really a benefit to it too, as opposed to just being, somebody who loves lots of different things and can't wait to pick up the next. First of all, I can only read one novel at a time. I can't jump from story to story. I need to be in one story from start to finish. But when it comes to nonfiction, I usually have 3 or 4 different nonfiction books going at the same time. And one of the real benefits to that, it's now been shown, is that if you're reading these different things, then the brain is naturally trying to draw connections between them. Looking for associations that otherwise wouldn't be there, and that the brain might even be forcing to connect. But the upshot is that then what's happening is you are analyzing and appropriating that information in a richer kind of more focused fashion than you would be if you were just reading the same book cover to cover, start to finish. So it's giving you time to process when you put one down and you're picking up the other. But then when the brain starts naturally trying to draw connections between the things that you're reading, you tend to retain more that way.
Found that to be true. And as you're saying it, it's going to sound like it's an ad. And if it sounds like an ad, it's an ad. I've just written a new book. It'll be out in April 2024, called De-Sizing the Church. And the subtitle is How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. And the only reason it came about is I'm taking information that is in the public sector. Everybody knows you can find it anywhere. But because I was reading multiple things at the same time and at different times from different sources, I started seeing these connections between our obsession with bigness, with the church growth movement, with the history of America, with the history of the church, with my experience in small and large churches, and putting things together in a way that I don't know anybody else has put together. There's nothing new in the book, but the way they're connected in the book has never been connected before. And it came about because of that kind of reading. So just as a quick example of how that actually takes place, that's what I'm currently doing right now, even with the book that's coming out soon. So that was takeaway number 3. Takeaway number 4 is trust that there is beauty to be found in all sorts of books.
Yeah, and this ties back into what you and I were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
Which is that we shouldn't limit our field of reading to just theology and commentaries and biblical study. And let's certainly not lose those, but let's add to them any manner of things: biographies, memoirs, science fiction, nature writing, essays, poetry, certainly fiction. That all of those things can aid us and will aid us as pastors if we're reading widely, and again, generously, charitably.
Point number 5 is try to read as much material offline as possible. And again, you don't mean not as an e-reader, but you're talking about scrolling, right?
Yeah, because the way that we read when we're just doing internet-based reading is there have been studies on this, that it tracks where the eye is and how quickly we're quickly doing like this hyper skim, and then we're clicking on hyperlinks and we're looking at ads, and we're all over the place, and that does not ultimately lead to the sort of meritorious things that reading otherwise does. In fact, as we talked about in the interview itself, can actually cut against those things in quite a way, because it makes us ultimately more impatient, just a little bit more irascible, just because, again, it's not the content itself that's necessarily doing it, though it might be some of that, but it's the way that the brain's being rewired when we're constantly doing that. We're actually rewiring our brains to make us more impatient and that kind of thing. And that's something to think seriously about.
Yeah. You also offer some practical advice. I don't know if it's on this point or one of the other sub points, doesn't really matter, about the importance, especially if you're not a regular reader, of having a specific time and a specific place and a specific format by which you read. Walk through some of those really practical steps, because this is what beginning to become a deep reader physically looks like in your life.
Yeah, this harkens back to the part about cultivating it as a spiritual discipline, that the best way to do that is not only to carve out 30 minutes, try to carve it out at the exact same time each day and do it in the same place. And then it becomes more and more associated each day with your rhythms of your day. And all kinds of literature, suggests that that's the best way to try to go about a discipline or a habit.
Weird thing from my cross-reference reading, Jerry Seinfeld, in his book about how he does stand-up, I mean, probably the most successful stand-up of all time, but he still continues to do it every single day. He sits down for at least one session, and for him, he sits down in the same place, the same seat, pulls out the same yellow ledger, and sets the clock for 33 minutes and 33 seconds. For some reason, that works for him. And his rule is, I'm not moving from this seat. I'm not taking these notepads out of my hand for the next 33 minutes and 33 seconds. I can sit here and stare at the wall and go around the rest of the day going, I did my unit and I'm done. or I might as well actually get some work done during that 33 minutes. And if it happens to go longer, it happens to go longer. But he has found that simple discipline. So again, it matches the small chunk. It matches the commitment to the time. It matches the time and place, seeing it as a discipline, and it comes from a completely non-theological source. You
And might
can't
I
get. Go
And
ahead.
might I also add, Carl, it's just case in point of what's lurking in the reservoir that you never had reason to think you were going to have to instrumentalize. I guarantee
I know.
you didn't read that and think, in 7 years, I'm going to talk to this pastor from South Carolina and I'm going to reference this on a podcast. That just is an example of these things that we just pick up along the way. And then we never know when, but suddenly they will pop up and be the perfect illustration for what we're trying to do.
Because I think stand-up comedy is one of the is the most difficult form of verbal communication that there is. And the people who do it well, I want to be able to learn something about that skill set so that I can communicate verbally better. I'm not going to set it up and knock it down every 30 seconds like a comedian does. But the skill set that is required to do that at a high level is something that I have been able to learn from. So there we go. Hey,
I
I
agree.
sure appreciate your time today. We had a really weird, interesting time getting it all set up, but we did get the technology solved. We got the whole thing in. We got the bonus content in. So much helpful stuff. I really appreciate it, Austin. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Carl. I loved it.
Got it.